Balance will be paid.
Good morning, guys.
Morning, ma'am.
Literally, 3 people have replied to good morning. I don't know what has happened to the basic etiquettes in online classes, guys. This is the basic thing, right? When you meet someone, you wish them. I don't think I need to teach this to anybody out here. All right, thank you everyone for your responses. You know, the stages come where we feel, oh, I mean, if students are saying good morning, it's a big deal, but that's not how it should be, right? So please make sure that not just for my class, but I mean, in general, you have to be courteous and, you know, nice to other people. That is something basic that I would expect from you all, apart from whatever we are doing. Right? Okay. Quick check. Are you able to see me, hear me, and see the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Perfect. All right. So we are going to do this chart today, right? We have to discuss this chart in detail. Yesterday, we did the 5 professional skills and we did ethics. So this is what we finished till yesterday. Now we are going to go forward and talk about, it's going to be a discussion, right? You'll be knowing most of the things. So it will be a discussion. The things that you don't know or have forgotten, I can quickly revise whichever areas that you think you are lagging behind, right? I hope apart from this, whatever we've discussed, so this is the third day of the session. I'm really hoping that the things that we discussed on the first day are taken care of, right? You all are, just a second. The meeting is being recorded, right? Can you see the recording icon?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, perfect. So basically, I hope you all are reading the technical articles. You all have thought about when do you want to appear for the mock paper, right? If not, maybe today after the class, let's say when you get free at 1:30, maybe have a good break, have lunch, and maybe you can start off around 3 and do a sitting from 3 to 7 or something like that. But I hope your plans are in place. You all are reading technical articles. You all have planned when are you going to read the examiner's report, right? So the last 10 days are very crucial, and don't just go in a haywire manner. Plan your days. For example, on 19th, I'm going to do this, 20th, I'm going to do this. So that ways, even your mind is relaxed that, okay, you have so many things to do, but you have decided when you're going to do what, right? And everything works accordingly. So make sure, I really hope that that is falling in place, right? So now we are going to move on to this section, right? That is integrated reporting and capitals. What do you guys remember about integrated reporting? And before we even go to this section, I want you all to know that integrated reporting, corporate social responsibility, social and environmental footprint, these are very important areas from exam point of view, because nowadays in practical life also, that consumers are becoming increasingly aware and environment conscious. So they will not buy from you if you are deteriorating the environment, right? So the CSR, etc., has become very, very important for the consumers, and because it has become important to the consumers, it becomes very, very important for the producer to take care of it. So in the exams also, it is repeatedly asked. At least one or two requirements are going to revolve around the environmental impact, the environmental footprint. So make sure that this area is taken care of, right? So what do you know about integrated reporting and the capitals?
Integrated report is a report which shows the stakeholders how an organization creates long-term value. And it also shows the interdependencies between the various capital it uses so that they can understand how they use these capitals to achieve value.
Darren has mentioned the answer. Traditional reporting was all about reporting on the financial matters. Integrated reporting is likely to consider all the aspects. Very good. So this is what we were looking at, right? So earlier there was only financial reporting. Even in today's time, if you look at the financial statements, the annual report, it is only financial analysis. So till now, integrated reporting is not mandatory, right? But in the years to come, it is definitely going to become mandatory, wherein along with the financial analysis, we are also going to do other analysis that mentions or that evaluate a company in its entirety, right? What are the 6 capitals? Manufactured or human, natural, good. Intellectual, very nice. social, right? So one is your traditional type of capital, that is your financial capital we've been considering for a very long time, right? So that is your traditional type of capital. Then we have manufactured capital. Manufactured capital are those goods or assets that help you in manufacturing further goods. You would have read this. This is manufactured capital. Human capital can be considered the as your employees, right? Even your employees in case of integrated reporting are considered to be capital, obviously, because these are the people working for you. If they are of good quality, right, then you have good capital. So basically, in integrated reporting, capital is anything that is going to help you generate profits in the future, right? That is anything that is going to bring in money for you in the future. So even human capital, like the employees who are working for you today, they are asset, they are treated as assets, and they are going to bring in revenues tomorrow, right? We also talk about the social capital, right? Social capital is your relationship with the society, and that society includes your customers, your general society, etc. Obviously, because of your relationship with them, you are going to bring in revenue in the future. Then we have natural capital. Natural capital is, land, air, etc., water. Intellectual capital can be your trademarks, patents, copyrights. All these are your intellectual capital, again, that you can encash to bring in money in the future. So my recommendation is that if you see integrated reporting in the paper, if you see any requirement that wants you to analyze the financial statements from an integrated reporting perspective, you have to talk about these 6 types of capital. It goes hand in hand. Integrated reporting is all about these 6 types of capital. So as soon as you read integrated reporting, you know that Yeah, I'm so sorry. I got locked off the meeting. So of the internet problem, but yeah. I was asking, what is the format of an integrated report? Anyone? So your integrated report is going to form a part of your annual report. It is going to be merged with your annual report. It is not a separate report. That's why it's called integrated, right? Perfect. Then we move on to the social and environmental footprint. No, you're not supposed to prepare IR. There's no format, guys. It is a part of your annual report, right? That's why it's known as an integrated report, right? What is the social and environmental footprint? What do you understand by social and environmental footprint? Let's talk about environmental footprint first. What is environmental footprint? Perfect. It's the impact improving our environmental. It's not improving our environmental performance. The mark that we leave behind as a result of any activity, yes. Direct and indirect impact towards the environment. Environmental impact of companies' activities like pollution emissions, very good. Also considering sustainability and carbon footprint, very good, right? So for continuing as an organization, so see, I'm walking forward as an organization, I'm walking forward, but what am I leaving behind will be my footprint. The impact that I have on the environment is my environmental footprint, right? So that is basically your environmental footprint. That is the impact you're leaving behind. Now that impact can be pollution, it can be carbon emissions, etc. And that is being taken very seriously by the companies nowadays, by the consumers also, by the government also, by all the companies also. The environmental footprint. What do you understand by social footprint? No, Nimisha, not required. Yes, stakeholder relationships. It can be positive also, Isha. Right, social relationships, the relationships that you have with your stakeholders, that is the social footprint. So while moving forward, how are you making your stakeholders feel about your organization? That is a social footprint, right? Impact on worker, customers, very good. Impact that my company's activities could lead to the society, like provision of employment, sponsoring for good causes, maintaining good relations with our surroundings. Perfect, Darren, good answer. So what is the impact that I would make in the society because of my activities, right? So so the examples are nicely put: provision of employment, sponsoring for good causes, maintaining good relations with our society. So that is going to be your social footprint, right? Then we have these ways. These are basically the standards: EMAS, GRI. Okay. Ramakrishna has a suggestion, guys. If you can put their points to everyone in the chat, everyone will be able to learn from the points, right? So instead of putting it as a direct message to me, if you all can put it to everyone, that should be okay, right? Fair trade and diversity in employees, perfect, right? So EMAS, GRI, and ISO, these are the standards. These are basically international standards that tell you about the environmental and social footprint. That is, how you should continue trading, how you should go about in the organization, the standards that you should follow in relation with your environment and the society, right? Then we have CSR. For CSR, you have the Carroll's model that we had to do yesterday, right? That we did also a little bit yesterday, but yeah, let's finish that one. So for CSR, if you see any question, you can use the Carroll's model. Right? Now, what is this model? It basically tells you that your social responsibility, okay, it has to be fulfilled, and it can be fulfilled in these ways. So there is a hierarchy in which you fulfill your responsibilities. I've made a very small diagram, but I hope you guys can bear with it. The first responsibility that we fulfill is the economic responsibility. Economic responsibility is our responsibility towards our shareholders. That is, when they have invested money in the company, it is our responsibility to give back the returns. So the first and major responsibility is that of the shareholders. See, obviously, because the company is theirs, they are the owners of the company. They are the reasons because of which the company is existing. If you do not fulfill your responsibilities towards them, then how will you fulfill your responsibilities towards anybody else? Because if they are not happy, the company will cease to exist. They might just withdraw their money and leave. Then you will not be able to fulfill your social responsibility anyway. So the first thing is economic responsibility. After you have started earning money for your shareholders, there comes legal responsibility. You have a legal responsibility of paying taxes, right? Until and unless you earn money, how are you going to pay the taxes? Right? So that is why we have economic responsibility. After the economic responsibility, we have legal responsibility, that is operating within, following all the rules and regulations, all the laws and regulations. At the same time, as a corporate citizen, paying our taxes, etc. That is your legal responsibility. Then we go on to the next one, that is your social responsibility. That is your responsibility towards the society, right? Perfect. And the last one is, so when you've done everything, when you've fulfilled the economic responsibility, legal responsibility, social responsibility, then you go on to the next level. I think you can correlate this to the Maslow's need hierarchy theory, even though I don't think that is in your syllabus. But you would have studied about it at some point in life, no? The Maslow's need hierarchy theory.
Yes, ma'am.
Right? So you go from, oh, my bad. This is not social, my bad. I missed out on the word. This is ethical, right? Ethical, that is right or wrong, right? Having the feeling doing the right thing is going to be ethical. And then we have philanthropic, that is when you fulfill all these, you go on to philanthropic, that is for the greater good of the society, right? When you go beyond just, right and wrong and just fulfilling your legal responsibilities to going on and actually doing good for the society, actively, voluntarily doing something that brings good or that adds value to the society as a whole in which you're operating. That will be your philanthropic responsibility, right? Yes, Ramakrishnan, that considers social and environmental when you voluntarily see. For example, all the listed companies in India that are making a certain level of profit are required to contribute 2% of their revenue to the corporate social responsibility. Now, even though this is about the society and environment, it will still fall under legal responsibility because you are bound to do that. What is the difference now? When I myself, without the foundation, go ahead for the greater good of the society and contribute, that becomes philanthropic. And when I'm required by law to do something, that becomes legal, right? So social and environmental can fall under any of these categories, but it more so depends upon whether I want to do it or whether I'm legally bound to do it, right? So that is there. Like charity, yes. Okay. Okay, so one question: what do we say about ethical having a culture like tone from the top culture? Can philanthropic be called as discretionary? You can call it discretionary, yes, and because it is at your discretion, it is voluntary. You can say that, and having a culture like tone from the top culture. It is not exactly a responsibility, then it is just a culture that your organization has, right, Darren? It is not a responsibility that you're fulfilling towards the society. So it's just a way your organization functions. You're not fulfilling any responsibility. So that will not be considered under CSR at all. It's a part of your culture. Okay, Ramakrishnan is saying ethical responsibility relates to Tucker model in decision making. You can correlate. See, the Tucker model is about when you're facing an ethical dilemma, whether you should do it or not do it, then you should ask yourself those 5 questions. That is about ethical decision making. This is a little different. This is about your ethical responsibility, right? So I'll just give you an example. Let's say if I start manufacturing a particular product in a particular plant, right, it is going to give me a lot of profits in the years to come. But at the same time, I know that the people around that plant, their livelihood will get affected because the pollution emissions are going to be a lot and which are not kind of acceptable, right? So in that case, my ethical responsibility, now there is no legal responsibility because there's no law as such. So I come to the ethical responsibility, that is having the sense of right and wrong towards the society and taking the right decision. And for this decision, then you can go to the Tucker's model, ask those 5 questions and accordingly go ahead. So yes, you can kind of interlink the two because both are related to ethics, but Carroll's model talks about your responsibility towards the society, and the 5 questions. The Tucker model talks about whether, when you're stuck in an ethical dilemma, how should you go about it? So that is the difference between the two, but sure, there is an interlink, right? Tell us the type of questions that come up from these topics, just a general idea. Anything, guys. I mean, you will be given a case, right? So they can ask you to do a non-financial analysis. A non-financial analysis is going to come from here only, right? That is the carbon footprint, the social footprint that they have on the society. So the green consumers, etc., that you talk about, right? So that can be there. Then I told you about analyzing a company from an integrated reporting point of view. So they'll be giving you a lot of material and you need to analyze how that company is functioning, not just from financial point of view, but then you have to analyze the human resource, right? For example, let's say in the current year, your revenue has increased, okay, but the headcount has gone down. Pay attention to this. The revenue in the current year has increased, but the headcount has gone down. What can be the analysis of this? One analysis, if you only look at the head count, you can say that probably the employees are not very happy with the work culture out here. That is why they are not staying in the organization. One thing can be that, right? But from human capital point of view, you can also say that the productivity has increased. Even though the headcount has gone down, the revenue has increased. That means revenue per employee has increased. That means the productivity per employee has increased. And you can say, therefore, the quality of human capital has probably increased. So this is just an example of the type of analysis that you'll be required to do given the case, right? It will differ from case to case, right? So these are some examples that can come. So basically everything will be given in the case. Mostly you have to analyze the company from different viewpoints. That can be from social, environmental, ethical viewpoints. So these are the type of questions that you can expect, right? I hope that is clear, Isha. Yes, you have to take the capitals and see if they have increased or decreased. You might not be able to quantify these types of capitals, right? But you can surely analyze and comment on that. Right? So we are done with this part of the syllabus. It's not zooming out. 1 second. Yeah. Any questions so far? We are done with the ethics and corporate social responsibility. Right till here. Any doubts so far?
Clear, ma'am.
Great. Okay. Perfect. Then we move on to the corporate governance part of the syllabus. This is something that you have been doing for a long time, right? You would have done in your audit also. So this should go smooth. Firstly, let's talk about corporate governance. What is corporate governance?
The way the company is controlled and directed.
What is the need for corporate governance? Mm-hmm. So can anyone talk in detail about the need for corporate governance? Yes, Khalida is right. Khalida, do you want to unmute and talk in detail about it?
In a way where the directors don't see only their interest but take into account everyone's all the stakeholders' interest. So the corporate governance framework will help to do that.
Can you think of some examples?
Is it a short-term profit for increased bonus versus long-term decision which benefit the shareholders? So that actually the alignment of interest is different. So this corporate governance framework and regulation helps to align the interest of the managers and the stakeholders or shareholders in the same direction.
Is Ramakrishnan's voice breaking for everyone or just for me? It's not breaking, ma'am. It's not breaking. It was clear. Yeah, but more or less I could figure out what you were saying, and absolutely right. So because the directors are in a position where they take all the decisions for the company, they can obviously misuse their power. So if I'm the director, I can give myself a huge pay raise, but I can, sack my employees saying that we don't have money to give you. I can give myself a huge promotion, but I can tell the shareholders that no, we don't have any dividend to pay you because we've not made any profits in the current year. So to avoid these kind of problems, we have a corporate governance regime in place wherein the directors are kept in check. Okay, and there are different ways in which we keep the directors in check. So I'm sure you know about these ways. Can we talk about good corporate governance principles that are there for the different companies?
And principles in the sense, are you asking about the transparency, accountability, integrity, or is it like the real rules, corporate governance best practices?
Best practices.
Okay, so best practices, we have difference of leadership, I mean, balance of power in the board, and introducing non-executive directors who are independent and take the shareholders' interest into consideration. We also have subdivision or delegation of important roles to specialized non-executive directors in the form of committees who also report these roles in a transparent manner to the shareholders and make sure that everything is carried out in a smooth manner. Then, yeah, that's it.
All right, let's just go step by step. First, we have a balanced board so that the executive and the non-executive directors, so they are balanced and there is no one set of directors that kind of dominates the entire board. And all the board decisions are taken in a fair and just manner. So that is the first thing. I don't need to go into the details of what are executive and non-executive directors, right? Going on to the next one, we have specialized committees for the 4 roles that the directors have. That is remuneration, nomination, risk, and audit. So I'm here. Right? So these are the 4 committees that we have to make sure that, these 4 important roles of the directors are well taken care of. For example, if there is no remuneration committee and if let's say the finance director is setting the pay of all the directors, it is going to lead to a lot of problems like bribery or favoritism, etc., and unjust payments, where directors might be rewarded when they are not even performing. So to avoid that, we have a separate remuneration committee that is made up of non-executive directors who are unbiased, independent, and they set the level of payment, the pay packages for the executive directors. Similarly, if there is no nomination committee, the executive directors will kind of bring on the board those people who they know will support their decisions, right? So to avoid that, again, we have an independent party, an independent board committee, that is the nomination committee. Then we also have the risk and the audit committee. So these are the various committees that are there. Then we have board of directors role and composition. The board should be balanced. Executive directors are led by the CEO. Non-executive directors are led by the chairman, and these should be two different people so that there is no abuse of power, and unfettered powers of decisions should not be handed over to one person. Okay, Ramakrishnan has a question. Do nomination committee actually hire the directors, or they can only recommend? They actually not.
Ma'am, we can't hear you.
Process goes on when they'll be interviewed, right, etc. And after that, the decision is taken as to whether we'll take board or. Just a second. Is it any better now?
Now it's okay, ma'am.
There is going to be a problem, guys, actually, because of, so the cyclone is not, I mean, not here, but then there are continuous rains out here, and like it's too, the rains are also very windy and everything. So the internet has gone for a toss. So might be a little problem, but I hope
It's not too frequent, okay? Like it's still manageable, no issues, ma'am.
All the committee members are selected during the AGM, right? Usually, yes, but then a committee can be made during the year also. But yes, because these committees are made by the shareholders only appoint the non-executive directors and these committees. It's fine, but sometimes these non-executive directors, the board can also make these decisions as to who will be there in these committees, right? But usually it is the AGM.
I mean, in regards to like a re-election of non-executive directors, the non-executive directors have a contract, right? For a working contract, like they are hired for like a period basis, right? 2 years, 3 years, and so on. Not through elections, right? Executive directors are elected annually, but non-executive directors are actually hired. They're external specialists, independent specialists who are actually hired on a contract basis, right? So do they actually also require re-elections every year?
Yes, they do require re-elections every year, because if there is any problem, if the shareholders are not happy with the non-executive directors, or if the non-executive director is not acting in the best interest of the organization, the shareholders should be given an option to always, get rid of that person, or to be able to continue with that person. So re-election is required, and after a period of 9 years, they cannot be re-elected. After 9 years, it's assumed that their independence is compromised and they cannot be re-elected on the board also. The maximum period is 9 years.
Ma'am, wouldn't it be biased if the board can choose the committee members, or I mean the non-executive directors?
Why? The board comprises of non-executive directors as well, right?
Okay, yeah. Sure.
Directors should be evaluated annually, yes. Could you repeat the answer to my nomination question? The nomination question was? The nomination committee. The nomination committee is going to nominate the people, nominate the directors they think are fit for the job. And then obviously there is a process, there is a recruitment process. They cannot directly hire. There is a recruitment process of interviews, negotiations, and then if everything is fine, then they are hired. So nomination, like the name suggests, if they are going to name the people or get the people on board to interview with the company, the people who they think are fit for the organization.
Ma'am, then finally, who hires, shareholders or other existing board of directors? Like,
The existing non-executive directors only.
okay.
Okay.
So,
They
ma'am,
will
in an
only
answer, do we write it like, you know, the nomination committee is going to select or recruit a new director in consultation with the shareholders, or just, you know, the non-executive directors are going to recruit them?
the nomination committee is going to appoint the new executive directors.
Okay, ma'am.
I have a confusion. I've read that FTSE 350 companies executive directors should submit for re-election in some other source. I've read 3 years term and a period of 9 years. Could you please let me know? Director's appointment. So it's a 3-year period, further extendable by 2 more 3-year periods. So that leads up to 9 years. But after a period of 9 years, you cannot reappoint a non-executive director. So if you read these texts also, it will say that they can be appointed for a period of 3 years, further extendable by 2 more period of 3 years. So that leads up to 9 years. But after 9 years, there's no way you can reappoint the director. Right? Perfect.
But ma'am, I have read in one of the technical articles that NEDs are appointed on a time limit basis of 3 years, and they can extend this period for a 2 consecutive years. That's it. No 9 years.
Oh no, it's for sure 9 years.
Okay.
2 consecutive period of 3 years hoga. You might have missed out on that, but for sure non-executive directors can be appointed for a period of 9 years. Yes,
But there should be a
yes.
gap of 5 years between an executive becoming a non-executive.
Yes, that is the cooling off period. That is definitely going to be there. We are just talking about for how long can one non-executive director be on the board as a non-executive director? The maximum time limit is 9 years. Right? All right. Nimisha is asking, ma'am, do we have to remember all the data related to years? There's not a lot of data. There's just cooling off period, and there's just the period that we discussed. And I think it should be okay. I mean, you should remember these this data. It's not a lot anyway. Yeah. Right? So that is there. Then we have the chairman, the CEO, we know the roles, right? Then we have the types, that is unitary tier and 2-tier board. Do you remember this? What is a unitary tier and 2-tier board?
A 2-tier is made of a supervisory board and a management or executive board, where the functions are separate. The supervisory board is made of all different types of stakeholders, and they are mainly focused on the strategic decisions of the company, whereas the executive board.
1 second. Supervisory board is made up of who?
many different stakeholders also come and represent the supervisory board, and they actually manage the executive board, they supervise, and they actually take part in strategic decision making only, and the day-to-day operations are carried out by the management board. Is that right?
What is a unitary tier board?
Unitary board is a single board which is made of executive and non-executive directors, and a chairman who leads the board, and a CEO who actually takes the operations into consideration.
Basically, the two types of boards, these are the composition is going to remain the same, just there are two levels in a two-tier board and there is only one level in a unitary tier board. So the board is there. The board is a mix of executive and non-executive directors. When both the executive and non-executive directors are on the same board, it is a unitary tier board. And when we have two tiers or two levels, wherein we have a supervisory board and we have a management board, that becomes a two-tier board. However, the composition is the same. The supervisory board is going to consist of your non-executive directors who are going to supervise and monitor the executive directors. And your management board is going to comprise of the executive directors, right? So if you see, the composition is the same. We have executive and non-executive directors on the board. When these are two different levels known as supervisory and management, it becomes two-tier. When it is only one board where all the directors are on one board itself, it becomes a unitary tier board. Right? Is that clear? I think someone wanted me to brief on this also. I hope it's understood.
Yes, ma'am.
Perfect. Then we have the NEDs. We know what NEDs are. Then we have CPD, that is continuous professional development. What is continuous professional development?
Ma'am, you missed out my question.
We've not spoken about agency theory as of now. It's still pending.
Okay.
I have not talked about agency theory. I'm going to come to that. Right? So, yeah, what is CPD? Keep the knowledge up to date. Yes. Improving their knowledge. Right? Yes. Okay. Nimisha has a question on composition of supervisory board. Tell me, Nimisha, what's the question? No, the supervisory board only has NED. And the management board has ED. That is why, see, we want to separate these two directors. That is the reason we are having two tiers. So supervisory board is only going to have NEDs. All right, great. So CPD is continuous professional development. You have to keep your directors updated with the current laws and regulations, with whatever is happening in the industry, etc. That is CPD, right? And this is not just for the board of directors, this is for any professional in the industry, right? So you have to continuously update your knowledge. For example, if you qualify ACCA in 2021 and later on if a new standard on auditing comes up, and if I ask you about that, you cannot tell me that, ma'am, I qualified then and that time it was not there, so I don't know about it, right? So professionals like us are expected to be updated continuously, right? So CPD, okay, Darren is saying CPD is providing the existing directors with the new technical skills and competencies that they require in the existing dynamic environment. Perfect. Then we have diversity. That is, on the board, we should have a diverse set of directors. You know, in the board, like nowadays, the companies are focusing on bringing in a lot of diversity. That diversity can be in terms of gender, because, you know, obviously there is a difference in the way you know, the male brains function and the female brains function. I'm not being sexist or anything, but then it is how it is. I mean, it's a natural thing, right? So if both sets, if both sets of brains work together, then we can, you know, get to an overall analysis of the situation. We can look at a situation from all points of views. So the more diverse your board is, the better your board will function, because whenever you face a problem, you're not just, so if everyone has the same set of thinking, then you're looking at all the problems from one angle only. But if we have diverse people, people coming in from different backgrounds, etc., right, then the solutions also will be innovative, and you will be able to get to better solutions in all the problems. So diversity is very important. It can be in terms of gender, it can be in terms of background, right? Very, very important. Then we have the role. We all know the role of the board of directors, right? The executive directors, they have operational responsibilities. The non-executive directors, they have more of supervisory responsibilities, right? Then let's talk about agency theory. Isha has a doubt on that also. We'll quickly revise that. What is agency theory, guys? What is agency theory?
When the directors do not work in the interest of their shareholders, there is some cost that is being incurred by the shareholders due to the directors taking decisions in their own interest rather than the shareholders. This leads to a conflict among the shareholders and the directors, and the shareholders are likely to incur a cost as a result of this, something known as agency costs. Yes.
Okay, so Darren has answered agency costs. What are agency costs? Fine. Agency relationship or agency theory is basically the shareholders. It's actually the money of the shareholders that they have invested in the business. Now, if I'm investing money, I should be taking the decisions as to what happens with that money. But there are so many shareholders that it's practically impossible for shareholders to run the business. That is the reason they appoint their agents, known as the directors, right? And these directors take decisions on their behalf. And this arrangement is known as the agency theory, wherein the shareholders appoint directors to take decisions on their behalf. This is the agency theory. Costs also, Darren explained. That is, all the costs that arise because of this agency relationship is an agency cost. For example, the salary of the directors. It is an agency cost, right? If we did not have this agency relationship, we would not be incurring this cost. If the shareholders were running the business, we would not be needed to pay the directors such high salary. So their salary is also an agency cost. If they give themselves any emoluments in the form of, you know, expensive, luxurious cars, etc., even that is an agency cost. Even audit is an agency cost, right? If the shareholders were only managing the business, there would be no need to get an audit done. Because if you remember, audit is to enhance the confidence of the shareholders in the directors. If shareholders are only managing the business, then we would not need an audit. So even audit is an agency cost, right? So this is the relationship between Okay. When a person represents other, okay. So can you talk about agency in public sector? Yes. So basically agency in public sector is all the more complicated. The reason is, see, in private sector, at least when I'm investing my money, I am the shareholder. At least I get a statement, I get the financial statement that tells me where my money is getting invested, what is happening in the organization. At least I get a record and a report of that. But what happens in a public sector? In a public sector organization, we do not really, when I am paying the taxes, I just pay my taxes. I do not know where that money is going, right? There is absolutely no accountability. The government doesn't give me a record of where my money was spent. So this agency theory is a bigger problem in the public sector, right? Are your doubts clear, Ramakrishnan and Isha? Your doubts were on agency theories. Are these clear? Do you have any more questions?
Ma'am, when they asked to explain complexity of agency theory in public sector, usually these complexity of agency theory in public sector is seen a lot, this question. So how can you actually explain the answer? I understand that the relationships are complicated, but is there like a definite answer or definite points which I can make in this question, this type of question?
Yes, I just told you, that the taxpayers, they don't know where their money is going. So there is no accountability. And that is all the more a problem in public sector agency, because there is no accountability of where the money is going. So the agency theory poses a bigger problem in case of a public sector. This is a standard answer that you can use for public sector agency theory.
Okay, ma'am.
Anyone else?
Ma'am, isn't it this similar point of view for charitable institutions, the not-for-profit, like the stakeholders, like the people who are giving sponsor donations, or the government which is giving grants? They are not sure whether money is being utilized. Isn't it the similar point of view? I mean,
Not really, because see, if I want to know, whenever I'm contributing to a charity, I have an option to restrict that fund to something or to use it generally. If I want that, let's say, whatever money I'm giving, it should be used in education of the socially backward classes. Firstly, I'll go to that type of an NGO and I will restrict my fund to only this use. Then I will restrict the fund and I will not allow my fund to be used for any infrastructural purpose. And if you want, you can also ask for a report from them, and they will give you, because you've provided a donation. Of course, if you give anonymous donation and if you give general donations, then yes, there is going to be a problem again. You do not know where your money was utilized. Okay, Isha has a question. Who is agent and principal in two-tier board? So technically, the principal is still your shareholders, right? Because they have invested the money, and the entire set of directors are your agents who are, working on behalf of the shareholders. So the agency relationship is between the shareholders and directors. It's not different for a two-tier board. For the two-tier board also, the entire set of directors act as your agents. Is that okay? How, Isha? Tell me how.
Ma'am, because supervisory board is the one who form all the strategies and give all the instructions to the operational board. That's why I think supervisory board is principal and the operational board is agent. And even ma'am, yeah, you say ma'am.
Principal and agency relationship talks about when agent is acting on behalf of the principal. So there has to be ownership firstly, and where on behalf of somebody, someone else is acting. In case of a two-tier board, the management board is doing what their responsibility is, and the supervisory board is doing what the supervisory board's responsibility is. Nobody is acting on behalf of anybody. No, they are both doing their jobs.
Okay, and ma'am, I want to clear one more thing that I read supervisory board is chaired by chairman and the operation board is chaired by CEO. And you are saying that supervisory board includes all NEDs. So can you clear this point?
Supervisory board includes all NEDs, and who leads the NEDs?
Okay, chairman,
Who leads the executive directors?
CEO.
CEO. And I told you that the executive directors, the management board is made up of executive directors. So the management board is led by the CEO. That's exactly what I said, right?
Okay, ma'am. Okay.
To talk about the directors' limitations on buying shares. Do they have limitations or they can buy limitless? Okay. Firstly, the non-executive directors cannot have any shareholding in the business, because obviously if they have shareholding, they will not be independent anymore, right? And for executive directors, it depends on company to company. Legally, there is no limitation, right? So that is there. But if a company wants to restrict, they have the power to restrict the directors on that also. So that is there. Nimisha is saying, ma'am, we did this past paper of 2020. It was like management board is agent to the supervisory board. Again, I mean, I don't find sense in this, because both are doing their jobs. If you want to say that the supervisory board is forming the strategy and the operational board or the management board is implementing the strategy, then maybe yes, but that is not exactly what agency theory talks about. It is more about, see, it's my work, but I'm delegating it to someone else. I am appointing someone else to do my work, right? So, but in case of these two-tier boards, it is carrying out the work or implementing the strategy was anyway not the job of the supervisory board. So they are not appointing the management board to get their work done, right? The major concept of agency theory is try and understand, it's my work, but I'm appointing an agent to do the work on my behalf, right? That works true in case of shareholder and the director, because the shareholder's money is involved. He is supposed to take decisions, but he has enacted someone or appointed someone on their behalf. That is agency theory. But if I'm a non-executive director, my job is anyway to form strategy. I'm doing my part. I'm not appointing the management board to formulate strategies on my behalf. So I'm doing my part, and the management board is doing its part of implementing the strategy. So I do not really see any agency theory here. Like, according to me, there's no agency theory. Right? Okay, Isha, I think, I mean, this is my say on this, my take on this, right? I would not write it as an agency theory, right? It's okay. There can be, different point of views also. Like, it is a theoretical, like it's not 2 + 2 is equal to 4, right? So another examiner can have a different point of view, but I just do not agree, because the basic concept of agency theory is not kind of fulfilling there. So it's your call to take. I mean, if you are convinced that an agency theory exists in a supervisory board, you can pick it up. But I do not agree with it, because I see two different jobs that are done by the people who are supposed to do it. Nobody has appointed someone else for a job. So there is no question of an agency relationship, right? Yes, Isha, always. Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is about corporate governance. A little bit here. Key concepts in corporate governance, we all know, right? So these are the reasons why we have corporate governance in place: to increase the investor confidence, to protect the shareholders, transparency, accountability, reputation, integrity, honesty. Missed out this here. I'll figure out what this is. Then there is independence, right? So these are the reasons why we have corporate governance principles in place, right? Rewards, guys, always remember, and this can be examined also, that is the salary or the rewards for executive directors, please remember, should be performance based. So if they are performing more, they should get more. And if they are not performing well, they should not be paid for bad performance. You have to always remember this. But for non-executive directors, their payment or their emoluments or rewards should not be performance based. Because if it becomes performance based, the independence will be compromised. If you start remunerating them on the basis of the profit that they bring to the company, then again, they will try and increase the profit of the company, which will affect their independence, right? These are two very important points that you need to remember, right? So the executive directors don't have a fixed monthly salary. They do have a fixed monthly salary, but some part of their emolument should also be based on the performance. It should also be based on the performance, right? Yes, NED is usually a fixed fee depending on the time that they sit towards on the board. It is usually on hourly basis that the non-executive directors are paid. Right? What do you understand by vision and mission, guys? Quickly, and the difference between the two?
Mission is what the company was formed for and what it wants to do. Vision is where it sees itself in the future. Now, vision and mission is normally, this is used when you talk about the suitability part. So when you analyze the strategies, remember, and use the SAF model, suitability, acceptability, feasibility, that's under suitability that you see whether the vision and mission of the company that you're looking at to acquire, whether that fits with your mission and vision or not. So that is there. Perfect, Darren. Yes. Then we have leadership, entrepreneurship, intrapreneurship. Firstly, let's talk about the difference between a leader and a manager. What is the difference between a leader and or leadership and management? Good, good, good. People follow the leader by choice.
and they follow the manager because they have to follow the manager by virtue of the position, right? So that is the major difference between leadership and management, right? And you would have studied the 4 types of leaderships, yes? Yes, Said, perfect. What are the 4 types of leaderships quickly? Autocratic, consultative, participative, and democratic, right? So these are the 4 types of leadership styles. Okay, which is the best style of leadership? Yeah, behavioral styles, yes. Very good. There is no best style of leadership. It depends on the scenario. Leadership is a contextual contextual figure, and it depends on situation to situation. So for example, in this class, since everyone is well behaved, answering properly, everything is going on well, I do not have to really unnecessarily be autocratic. We can be, and we are being democratic. We are discussing everything here. But if, let's say, there is a class where it's difficult to control and other issues, then I might have to go and follow autocratic leadership out there. So it totally depends on the context, on the case. There is no best style of leadership, right? Please remember this. Then we have entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship, right? What is the difference between the two? Can you talk about both?
I think entrepreneurship is where, an entrepreneur is an individual who is likely to start a business, but he's likely to be the owner of the business and he's going to take all the risks and losses. An entrepreneur is a person who is likely to be an employee of a particular company, and he usually has minimum ownership and minimum risk of loss.
Perfect answer, Darren. In entrepreneurship, the risk and reward lies with the entrepreneur. But in case of intrapreneurship, since he is an employee, the risk and reward will still lie with the company. The risk and reward will still lie with the entrepreneur and not the intrapreneur. Right? I hope that's clear.
Ma'am, do we have to learn things like visionary leadership and so on? I saw it somewhere. Is that a topic actually?
Not required.
Okay, ma'am.
Well, I mean, you will not be able to use it only in any answer. Okay. Then what are the traits of a good leader or a good entrepreneur? Good decision maker, risk taking. Okay. Information from the case, self-confidence. Okay. Okay. Keeps the team together at all times. Looks at the problem from an overall viewpoint and not just from one view, right? Or from one dimension. Takes a helicopter view of the situation. Helicopter view means that you are not very close to one dimension. You rise up and you look at the overall thing. You think about the long term. You don't think about the short term benefits, right? Knowledge, foresightedness, perfect. Corporatus, yes. Administrative ability, yes. These are traits of a good leader. Any models on leadership that we've done?
The McGregor's model and McGregor's theory, Excel theory, why can be a model.
So guys, today I want you all to read the technical article on leadership. Okay, there is everything in detail out there. We've covered most of it, right? So today, if you read the leadership part of, leadership is all together on the website. Please read it today itself so that this part of the syllabus is taken care of, right?
But in the technical articles, there's only related to cultural web and ethics, not related to leadership. In the ACC
Yeah, that
technical
is
article.
all we need also.
Okay.
Yeah. They have just mentioned a little bit about your different styles of leadership also, but yeah, I mean that is all that is required also under leadership. Okay, Isha is asking about the Mintzberg model, the Mintzberg building blocks. Let's discuss the Mintzberg building blocks also. No, Nimisha, not really. Go through that technical article, you'll get more clarity, right? So Mintzberg building block is there. Let's quickly do that. Now, Mintzberg says that if you want to build an organization, there are building blocks. Building blocks are what? The EAT that you have, you know, when you want to build up a house, you need some building blocks to entirely make that structure. So Mintzberg also says that if you want to build up an organization, you need 7 building blocks, right? What are the 7 building blocks, guys? Tell me.
5, right? Techno structure, technical support, strategic apex, middle line, and then the operating core.
Support staff and ideology also.
So we have strategic apex, we have the operational line of management, and we have the middle line of management. First, these are the 3 lines of management. You would have studied, no, the 3 levels of management: top, middle, and operational. This is the 3 levels of management. Strategic management, they are going to obviously decide the strategy. Operational is going to execute that strategy. So this we know, right? Apart from this, you need ideology, right? That is how your organization is going to proceed further, the ideology. Then you need the techno structure, that is the technology and the infrastructure, right? Then you need the support staff. All right, what else is there? What else is there for the building block? Yes. Fine. So these will be your managerial areas. The management has to take care of this. That is the strategy, the middle line, and the operational line. Operational line is responsible for implementing the strategy. Apart from that, obviously, if you want your organization to grow, there has to be the ideology, the ideas have to be in place, right? So where do you want to go? Which problem are you solving? If you have an organization, what is the purpose of the organization? Which task are you making easy? The ideology. You should have the techno structure. Techno structure is basically amalgamation of two words, that is technology and infrastructure. So you should have the right type of technology and the infrastructure. And you have the support. Support means your HR function can be a support. Your procurement function can be a support, right? So IT, all these are your supports. So Mintzberg basically says that when you put these building blocks together, only then will you be able to establish an organization. If any of these blocks are missing, then you cannot really build up an organization of your own. Right? Isha, I hope that is clear. Do you have any other doubt in this? Okay. Nimisha is asking, where do we apply this model? So usually, directly it's not applicable, but if in the exam, you're able to, if they tell you that whether this organization should be established, whether, this strategy should be taken up, if you can find out that, the technology, whether it's there or not, ideology is there or not, that ways you can use. But usually, trust me, it's not really directly applicable. You can at max, pick up the technical words from this model. Like instead of saying idea, you can talk about ideology. Instead of saying the infrastructure and technology, you can talk about technostructure, right? The strategic apex. So you can pick up the technical words from this model and try and use that in your answers. That is the major takeaway. Ramakrishnan, what exactly do you want to know? Configuration as in what?
Ma'am, I heard somewhere about the Mintzberg 6 configuration based upon these structures such as professional bureaucracy, machinery bureaucracy. Is that based upon this, right? These 5 building blocks. So
that is there in the technical articles.
Okay.
Have you read it?
No, ma'am.
Read it in the technical articles. It's very nicely given. If you still feel there are any questions, you can ask.
Okay, ma'am.
Not really, Nimisha. That won't be covered in this. Right? Anything else, guys? Anything else that you would want to talk about under leadership, Mintzberg, anything? Okay, Nimisha, let's take that towards the end. You can tell me what exactly you did not get, right? We can take that in the end, right? So this is done. The corporate governance part, I think, is covered, right? We've covered the entire thing. This is left, stakeholders. Taking all the stakeholders into consideration, firstly, we have the stakeholders map, right? So which is the best model for stakeholder analysis?
Mendelow's.
Mendelow's, right? I hope everyone knows it. Do I need to explain anything in Mendelow's? Perfect. So Mendelow's is taken care of. That itself is the shareholders map, okay? So Mendelow's model is the stakeholders map. That is, you find out how important the stakeholders are and what is their power, and in accordance with that you fulfill their demands. Obviously the ones that are more important and have more power will be the key players, and you will have to satisfy their demands the earliest, and in accordance with their power and interest in the organization, you're going to fulfill their demands, right? You can link this with the CSR also. So corporate social responsibility is towards your stakeholders, right? Now you have a responsibility towards all your stakeholders. So how to prioritize which responsibility to fulfill first will depend upon the importance of the stakeholders and the interest that they have in the organization. If they are key players, their claims will be satisfied the first. For example, shareholders, you will always try and keep them happy, you'll keep them satisfied, right? So they are the key players, you have to look after them first. Let's say later on the general public, the general society will come later. If you think about it, you can link it to the Carroll's model also. Carroll's model, what did we decide? That first we are going to take care of our shareholders. Why are we taking care of our shareholders? Because they are the key players, right? So if you try and interlink, everything kind of makes sense. All of this is going to come to the same conclusion, that you need to prioritize the claims that you're going to fulfill first in case of CSR as well, right? Isha, I said shareholders are the key players. They do not have low interest, they have high interest and they have high power. So they are key players. Okay. Then we have the type of stakeholders. You would have studied, no? The type of stakeholders, voluntary, involuntary, right? Then we have passive, active, all these types of stakeholders. I hope that is taken care of. Do you need me to explain anything around that? Internal, external, yes. All clear? Great. All right. So this is taken care of. So we are done with so much, and now we are going to go ahead and do the risk part of it. Risk is important. Questions are asked in risk, right? This is again corporate governance, public sector we finished, so I'm not going to focus on that. We have the risk management process, right? What is the risk management process? Firstly, these four blue boxes are your risk management process. First, you identify the risk, you assess the risk, you formulate the strategy, and you monitor the risk. This is your risk management strategy, right? In identification of risk, you have a lot of areas that you need to look at. You know, when you identify one risk, you have to identify all the correlated risks as well, right? So when you identify the pandemic, you identify the correlated risk, that is unemployment, right? That is the economy will now go into recession. So all the correlated risks are identified along with the risk that you identify. Then we have the ALAP principle. What is the ALAP principle?
As low as reasonable, practicable. Yeah.
Right. So obviously, naturally, you want to keep the risk as low as possible and your rewards as high as possible. That is how it works, right? Then we have categories. Risk appetite. Do you remember what risk appetite is?
It's based on your risk capacity and your shareholders' view towards risk.
much risk the company is willing to take. How much risk can a company take is the risk appetite, the tolerance. What does the risk appetite depend upon? What are the factors that contribute to risk appetite?
There are two factors: the level of risk which the company directors consider desirable and the capacity of the company to actually bear it.
Very good. So first will be the attitude that you have. Some are going to be risk aggressive, some are going to be aversive. So that is the first factor. And second is the capacity, like you said, whether you have the capacity to take the risk or not. That both of these factors taken together form your risk appetite. Simple, no? Let's say I am risk aggressive, right? You want to take, let's say you want to acquire, let's say Reliance. Okay, now there is a big risk involved, but you have the attitude to take that risk. But do you have the capacity? If you have the capacity, only then will you have the appetite. Otherwise, you cannot really acquire Reliance. So appetite is going to depend on two things: capacity and attitude. Right? And risk is obviously subjective in nature, and it is also uncertain. You have to continuously monitor the risk. Obviously, since it's subjective, like something might look very risky to me and it might not be very risky according to you. That is the major difference in our attitudes. Right? So, some people, when you're appearing for the exam also, some people are going to be of the attitude ki हाँ ठीक है, नहीं हुआ तो नहीं हुआ ना, it's fine, नहीं हुआ तो, right? So it's not risky, it's not anything major. But some people are going to take it seriously, right? They consider the risk of failing as a big risk. So it is going to be different for company to company. Then we do the assessment. The assessment is going to happen with the internal controls. You assess the internal controls and check how high is the risk. Internal audit, sound controls and compliance. So if these are in place, then the assessment is that, okay, maybe the risk is low. And all these factors are going to contribute to that risk. Then you have the risk strategy. After you have identified and assessed the risk, after assessment, you basically see what is the probability and what is the impact. And according to the probability and impact, you form your strategy as to whether you're going to transfer, avoid, reduce, or accept. That is going to be your strategy. Now, once you have selected the strategy, it's not like it's done. Now we are going to follow this strategy only for time, we don't know, for the ongoing business. Risk is uncertain in nature. It changes from time to time, and it's very important that you monitor the risk from time to time. That is why the fourth aspect is risk monitoring. Right? Okay, Nimisha is asking, what is the difference between risk appetite and capacity? Capacity is a part or a component of appetite. Appetite consists of two things: risk attitude and capacity. Attitude means whether I am an aggressive risk taker or an aversive risk taker. That is attitude. Capacity is whether I have the sources, whether I have the money and everything to take that kind of risk or not. That is my capacity. Both of these together form my appetite. Is that okay? Is that clear, Nimisha? Perfect. Okay. So risk is done. So we are done with at least half of the syllabus revision. Okay, read about enterprise risk management system that was given by COSO. Where exactly could this be applicable? You will not be able to exactly apply it to a particular case. Like I have tried it, but cannot directly apply it to the case. Again, you can just pick up the technical words from the model and use it. Okay, that is the maximum you can do, because as it is being able to apply, it looks like a difficult cause, not going to happen, because cases are going to be different. I don't think you'll be able to do it. Nimisha is asking, where do we use the ALAP principle? No, ALAP is a principle that is general, like you generally want to keep the risk as low as possible. So when you want to, when you are analyzing different strategies, right? If let's say two different strategies are there, A and B, and the rewards in both of them are same, but the risk is higher in B, using the ALAP principle, you can choose strategy A. It'll be used like this, because you want, if the returns are same, you would want to keep the risk as low as possible. I'll try, Nimisha, I'll try to discuss it, but since it's not very important from exam point of view, let's cover the more important areas first, and if we get time, we can do it, right? Not very important from exam point of view. Okay, now we have the external internal analysis that we are going to cover today quickly, right? External analysis, you all know PESTEL. I'm not doing PESTEL. 5 forces, you all know. National competitive advantage, that is the Porter's diamond, hopefully you all know. The industry analysis and forecasting methods, these two are used for the quantitative analysis that we spoke about yesterday, right? So you have to do the analysis whenever given in the question paper. You have to do some quantitative analysis. Industry analysis is basically analyzing the industry that your company is in. So for example, if the industry is earning a gross profit of 5% and your company is saying that they are earning a profit of 15 to 20%, then you need to analyze how that is happening. I'm not saying it's impossible, but you need to analyze. Right? So these are the different external analysis that you all can do, right? External to your company. Yes, ratios. So anything that you would want me to explain in external analysis? I think this was, this is something that you have been doing. Usually in external analysis, we use the 3 models, that is Porter's diamond, Porter's 5 forces. If it is concentrating, if the question is more about competition and etc., then you focus a lot on Porter's 5 forces. If it is general, then you go on to PESTEL model.
Ma'am, from the portions, I have not actually covered the forecasting methods, like the calculation part. So is it like important? Like, should I have to like go back and understand how to forecast? Because I actually find this mathematical time series and a little bit tough to do it. So then that's why I had actually left it. So is it like extremely relevant to the examination? Is it better to like learn?
No, honestly not. You will not be required to forecast anything, right? So it does not really make sense to, you will not be required to forecast the revenues, etc. That won't be covered in SPL. That is a part of your financial management, like AFM, etc., where you have to do the actual calculation. So anyway, you will not be required to calculate. So it's okay if you've not done it also. It's not examined in SPL.
Okay, thank you.
Then we have marketing management. Marketing management, you would have done segmentation, right? That is breaking your entire market into different segments. That can be according to the geographical location, right? That can be according to the customer preference, different bases on which you can break your market down and accordingly manage the market. Then you have marketing mix, that is the 7 P's of marketing mix. I'm sure you would have done it. Branding, the 6 I's of marketing. I mean, the benefits of electronic or internet marketing, the 6 I's you would have done. And CRM is the customer relationship management. All these are different models, right, that you would have done in the course of your studies. Is there anything in specific that you would want me to explain?
Ma'am, can you explain the 6 eyes?
Pretty easy, yeah. Have you done it? Have you read it? It's integration. That is, different when you use internet marketing. If you see, if I market using or brand using the internet, if I want to, if you are searching something on Myntra and something is in your bag in Myntra, you will see that ad when you scroll on Instagram also. You'll see that ad when you scroll on Facebook also. Right? So that is integration. So if you read all these points, these are very easy. Just go back, read the 6 eyes. Yes.
I just wanted to know when it is, what exactly the use of the particular thing.
These are just the benefits of internet marketing. If you market using the internet, what are the various benefits that you have? That you get to do integrated marketing is one benefit, right? Infrastructure independence is another benefit, that you don't have to have a physical infrastructure. You have the infrastructure on the internet. That is one benefit. So these are just benefits of electronic or internet marketing.
All right, ma'am. Thank you.
Right?
Ma'am, where do we actually mention this push marketing and pull marketing? Like in what scenario do we actually include it with the 6 eyes, or like how do we apply it?
No, that is a part of your supply chain management. It's not a part of 6 eyes. So basically, if the market is customer led, if you are not the only supplier, if there is a lot of competition, and if the market is consumer led, then it is a pull type of supply chain mechanism. And if, let's say, you are the only supplier supplying a particular thing, then you are leading the supply chain. So that becomes a push type supply chain. It's not a part of 6 eyes.
Okay.
In interactivity, do you want me to explain what interactivity is?
Ma'am, I'm just adding to his point. I think I'm not sure who spoke before, but interactivity, like earlier we had the push way of model where we used to go to the customers, but today it is like the customers are browsing and checking for the various product lines that we have. So can't we add this pull and push model when we are explaining about interactivity?
Dragon, I lost your voice. Is there a problem at my end or?
Your end, ma'am.
Okay, you're saying that in the interactivity part of it, you want to include the push and pull SCM. Okay, can do. So how you are transitioning from a push SCM to a pull SCM, even that can be a benefit of, yes, you can include that.
Ma'am, even I read it for the difference between traditional marketing method and what is we are doing today. Like in earlier times, there was push strategy, but now it is pull strategy where customers are coming to us. I think it is this.
Right. So you can include it in the interactivity part of the 6 eyes. Perfect. Can do. I just thought that, I think Ramakrishnan is getting confused with, whether that is a part of 6 eyes or not. So it is a different thing, right? The supply chain mechanism or the supply chain management is different from the 6 eyes. So I thought he was asking the difference. I mean, whether it's the same or not, it's definitely different. But yes, the transition from a push style to a pull style mechanism can be a benefit and can be considered under interactivity. That is fine. Then I think someone was asking CRM. Does anybody want to elaborate on CRM quickly?
May I, ma'am?
Yes, go ahead.
So this is customer relationship management. There are 3 stages. First is customer acquisition, where we find our customers. Second is customer retention. What are the things we do to retain our customers? And next is how we extend them. That is customer extension. This is the all thing in CRM.
Right. The 3 stages. First, you acquire the customer, retain the customer, and so these are the 3 stages, right? When you have to manage your relationship with the customer. First thing would be to have a customer, acquire the customer, retain the customer, and then convince the customer to buy more of your products. So if currently they are buying, let's say, shirts from them, I will try and expand and try and get them to buy trousers also from them. So that is customer expansion or extension, whatever you like to call it. These are the 3 stages of customer relationship management. Is that okay? I think Nimisha asked. Nimisha, is that fine?
In relation to branding, we talk about e-branding, right? In this case, this is actually e-branding, right? Like the 4 things were like using the same brand and then slightly differentiating the brand, or bring in exactly new brand, or collaborating with someone else to bring the brand. This is what's talked about in the branding, right?
Yes.
Okay.
These are the different things that you can do when you like different ways of branding your product when you already have an established product. You can launch a new brand, you can launch under the existing brand, you can launch in collaboration with someone else. These are the options that are available to you under branding. Right? Okay, guys. We've covered quite a bit today. So we will be finishing up tomorrow, obviously. So we'll try and finish this up quickly tomorrow, and then we move on to the questions from tomorrow, right? So the plan for tomorrow will be to quickly revise this, and then we go to the models. Most of the models we have done during the revision only. But if there is anything that you would want me to explain in detail, in these models, we'll do that, right? So, okay, Syed is asking what is the difference between upward and downward SCM? These are just other names for push and pull SCM, right? So, just other names for push and pull SCM is upward and downward SCM.
And where is the supply chain management actually taught? Like which part? I've actually not come across this when I was doing my portions in the study text. Is it like the study text? Supply chain, which is it under strategy?
Yes,
It's under e-marketing.
I will be able to tell you the exact chapter tomorrow if you want the chapter number, but it is in the study text.
Okay, like it's under strategy, right? Like strategy area, right? Like
come under
I think it is chapter 19 or 20. 19 or 20.
It should be later on only under marketing, under under marketing basically. It should come under marketing.
Ma'am, is it an important area?
If you want, I will check it for you. The exact chapter, if you want, I'll tell you tomorrow. For supply chain management, you can check but yeah, it is going to be later on only in the later chapters where we do marketing, branding, etc. Okay, Darren is saying it comes under chapter 18 of the study text. Perfect. Thank you, Darren.
Ma'am, I want to clarify one more thing. When it comes to I'm going back to the remunerations committee. So when we are thinking about the remuneration of the executives, the basic salary is always fixed, no matter whether the company fails or doesn't fail, the basic salary is fixed. But the performance related pay is for the executives, the remuneration committee will decide depending on individual contribution to their performance. I mean, individual performance and their contribution to that particular objective or strategy. Am I correct? I'm not very sure because I've seen many questions, but I'm not clear with this.
Basically, when we say that the executive directors should be, they should be paid according to their performance. This is decided individually by the company, so there is no fixed rule. But yes, mostly if let's say I get this much of revenue for the company. Since I'm the director, I'll get business for the company. Whatever business I get for the company, a percentage of that can be given to the director. That can be there. A percentage of profit can be given to the director. So any performance related feature can be given to the director, and that is an individual choice. It's not that it's not standard across companies. The non-executive directors are the best judges as to how they want to do it. Also, there are different ways in which the directors can be evaluated. They can be evaluated individually, like we just spoke, as a percentage of profit or as a percentage of the business that they get into the company. They can also, the entire board can be evaluated as a whole, the entire executive director, as to how they have performed in the current year, and everyone can be given a performance related bonus. That can be there, depending on their contribution. The directors can be analyzed or awarded in terms of groups also. If you have some different committees on board, that is also how they can be evaluated. But what you said can also be done, and as a percentage of profit can also be a way of awarding them or remunerating them in the business. There is no one set way, but yes, there is a salary that is given, and it's not even mandatory to give them a performance related bonus, but it is just a good practice. It is just a good practice if they are remunerated on the basis of the profits, etc. Right? Because that way, someone who's not performing well in the business, no one is remunerated for poor performance. So it's just a good practice, but it's not mandatory. And that is why there is no standardized practice also, because it is not mandatory, right?
Okay, ma'am.
Thank you, Ramakrishnan. You too have a great day. Glad to read that.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes, Nimisha.
Ma'am, I studied about corporate management structure like synergy manager, parent portfolio manager. I don't know what is it. Like there were 3 things.